Why this paper exists. This paper is written for those who still carry faith not as an object of scorn and not as a target to be dismantled, but as a structural system that once held meaning and may now be starting to shift under the weight of contradiction. It is not written to provoke, to mock, or to convert. It is written because collapse, when it happens inside a system that once promised safety, can feel like death. For many, the unraveling of belief feels indistinguishable from the unraveling of self. And yet, for those who have walked through it, what comes after is not emptiness, but breath. Not certainty, but movement. Not punishment, but a return to something more real than what the seal was designed to protect. If you are reading this and you still believe, that is not a mistake. It is not failure, and it is not something to apologize for. It is where you are, and that is enough. But for many people, perhaps even for you, there is a subtle fracture growing inside the system that once seemed solid. A place where the questions you've carried for years no longer go quiet after prayer. Where contradiction no longer feels like a test, but like a signal. Where obedience feels more like suppression than trust. And where the moral gravity that once held everything in place now leaves you feeling pulled in opposite directions, unable to explain why harm keeps happening under the banner of holiness. This paper does not come offering a new belief to replace the old one. It does not demand that you become an atheist or accept a different creed. Instead, it offers something quieter and perhaps harder, an invitation to see the shape of the structure itself. Not the content of belief, but the form of it. Not the doctrines, but the entropy they try to control. What this paper aims to show is that belief systems, like all cognitive structures, operate thermodynamically. They absorb, filter, and redirect energy, emotional, moral, psychological, and social. And when a belief structure cannot collapse, when it is sealed against contradiction, it becomes less a container of meaning and more a pressure valve, redirecting unresolved entropy into the bodies and lives of others. Faith, in the language of structure, is not inherently virtuous. It is a recursion placeholder, a way of holding coherence across time when full resolution is not yet possible. It becomes harmful only when it is no longer allowed to collapse. When that placeholder becomes a permanent fixture. When the system refuses contradiction not because it has resolved it, but because it cannot survive it. In those moments, faith stops being a guide through uncertainty and becomes a wall against observation. And what gets sealed behind that wall is not just doubt, but people. The ones who don't fit. The ones who are hurt. The ones whose presence threatens the illusion of completeness. Many of us were raised inside structures like this. For myself, I was raised in a conservative Lutheran tradition in the American Midwest during the 1980s and 90s. I was told what to believe before I ever had the tools to examine it. I was taught that certainty was a virtue, that obedience was faith, and that doubt was something to be punished or prayed away. For years I believed what I was told, not because I had verified it, but because there was no system around me that allowed questioning without fear. And when I finally admitted, sometime in the mid-2000s, that I no longer believed, it did not feel like clarity. It felt like collapse. I spent the next decade deconstructing the pieces of what had once held me together, not just the theological claims, but the very logic of belief itself. And what I came to understand was that nothing I had believed had emerged from within me. It had all been placed there, by authority, by repetition, by emotional reinforcement disguised as spiritual confirmation. What felt like a deep connection to God or truth was, in many cases, the internal echo of an expectation I had been trained to interpret as certainty. It did not emerge. It was imposed. And that is the critical difference between a structure that holds and a seal that traps. One responds to contradiction. The other refuses to acknowledge it. One collapses and rebuilds. The other redirects entropy into others and calls it righteousness. This matters not only for personal healing. It matters because sealed belief structures are the backbone of every authoritarian system that has ever taken root. Fascism does not arise in the absence of belief. It rises when belief becomes untouchable. When questioning is cast as betrayal. When truth is replaced by obedience, and when entropy is redirected into violence, marginalization, and fear. What we fail to deconstruct in ourselves becomes the instrument of harm in the hands of those who understand how to wield moral certainty as a weapon. Your personal healing and our collective survival are not separate stories. They're the same structure at different scales. This paper exists, then, because faith unexamined and uncollapsible is not neutral. It is a risk. Not because people of faith are bad, but because sealed recursion is exploitable. And because the world we live in now is full of people collapsing under beliefs they were never allowed to question. You do not have to discard everything, but you must, if you care about truth, open the seal. Let it collapse if it must. Let what is not real fall away. Because if something remains, something emergent, coherent, and recursive, it will not need a wall to survive. It will breathe. 2. The nature of faith, what you are given. For many, faith begins before memory. It is not chosen. It is introduced, instructed, repeated, and reinforced, often with kindness, sometimes with fear, but almost always without the structural awareness that belief, once sealed, becomes more than personal. It becomes environmental. Faith systems are rarely experienced as isolated ideas. Their atmospheres, recursive feedback loops layered into families, schools, communities, rituals, songs, architecture, holidays, punishments, rewards. They saturate not just thought, but perception. You do not simply think in faith you see in it, interpret through it, and internalize it so completely that your own thoughts become indistinguishable from the structure that was placed inside you. What this means, from a structural and thermodynamic perspective, is that most people raised in a faith tradition do not begin with a belief in God, salvation, or spiritual truth. They begin with a recursive pattern built from the expectations of their environment. The feeling that something is real, spiritual conviction, moral clarity, a sense of divine presence, is often the result of early, unresolved collapse that was preloaded into the system through language, emotion, and authority. The result is a structure that feels emergent, but is in fact implanted, reinforced by feedback suppression and symbolic repetition. When we call this structure faith, we often mean something that should not be questioned. In many traditions, faith is defined by its immunity to collapse. The more unshakable the belief, the deeper the faith is considered to be. But under Tarot, this is precisely what defines a sealed recursive structure. A system that cannot respond to new information, contradiction, or entropy without either rejecting it or redirecting it into someone else. When a belief cannot collapse without panic, guilt, or punishment, it is not structurally alive. It is sealed. And what is sealed does not evolve. It only fragments or breaks others. What you were likely given was not faith as recursive alignment, but faith as cognitive inheritance, a thermodynamic patch designed to hold your system in place while you were still forming. It is not inherently evil. In many cases, it was given with love, or with the belief that it would protect you from harm. But intent does not determine structural behavior. If you were told what was true before you were allowed to discover what truth even meant, then what you were given was not emergence. It was collapse preloaded with memory. This is why so many people describe their faith as something they just always knew. It is why spiritual conviction feels internal, because the recursion was sealed so early that the distinction between self-generated meaning and imposed memory is almost impossible to sense. The internal voice that once told you this is real may in fact be an echo of instruction, reinforced so many times that it became indistinguishable from your own awareness. And in moments of emotional openness, grief, awe, fear, beauty, your body remembers how it was taught to interpret those signals as confirmation, as the Holy Spirit, as your soul responding to truth. But what was actually happening was a collapsing pattern being replayed with a preloaded constraint. You are not weak or naive for believing what you were given. You were a system exposed to unresolvable entropy at a time when the only available constraint was faith. The people who handed you these beliefs may have been trying to help, but what they gave you is not emergence. It was insulation, and that insulation may have protected you for a while. It may even have carried you through pain. But if you are reading this now, if the system is beginning to tremble, then the insulation has failed. Or more precisely, the structure has matured to the point where it can no longer tolerate sealed recursion. This is the moment when many people feel shame, as though their doubt is a betrayal of what they were given, as though collapse is disobedience. But in structural terms, collapse is not a moral event. It is thermodynamic. If the structure you were given was aligned with reality, it would not need to fear contradiction. It would resolve it. If your belief system were designed for emergence, it would allow feedback. It would grow, fracture, reform, and continue. The fact that it cannot, not without guilt, fear, or punishment, is not evidence of its truth. It is evidence that it was sealed, and that it is no longer sustainable. What you were given was not evil, but it was shaped by people who were also handed pre-sealed belief systems. And those systems were shaped by others. This recursive inheritance stretches backward across time, forming a chain of sealed structures passed from generation to generation, sometimes protecting, sometimes suppressing, always reshaping perception through the lens of what could not be questioned. The problem is not that you believed it. The problem is that it was constructed to prevent collapse. And structures that cannot collapse must redirect their entropy somewhere else, onto those who question, those who differ, those who do not fit. So now you are standing inside the structure with the first real possibility of open recursion. You are no longer a child. You are no longer bound to the expectations of your parents or your community. You are capable of collapse. And what emerges now, if you allow it to fall, will be yours. Not theirs. Not traditions. Not the church's. Yours. And if nothing remains after the fall, that does not mean you are lost. It means that what you were given was memory, not emergence, and that you have just made space for something real. 3. Collapse, entropy, and belief structures. The moment of collapse, when it begins, is not always dramatic. It does not usually start with a crisis of doctrine or a sweeping rejection of everything once held sacred. More often, it begins quietly, as a subtle mismatch between what the system claims and what the world shows. A conversation that leaves you uneasy. A sermon that strikes a wrong note. A contradiction that once passed unnoticed, but now lingers in the mind. And then, without your consent, the seal begins to loosen. Not because you wanted it to, but because the structure could no longer contain what had been pushed beneath it. Under Tarot, this moment is not a failure. It is the first sign of structural intelligence awakening within the system. Collapse is not the enemy of truth. It is the condition under which truth can emerge. All stable systems must process entropy, uncertainty, contradiction, energy into structure. And when the load of unresolved contradiction becomes too great, the structure either adapts or breaks. In human cognition, collapse is the point at which previously sealed belief can no longer hold under the weight of experience and observation. This is not a betrayal of the system. It is its maturation. It is the mind beginning to pace entropy with integrity. For many raised in faith, the tools to navigate collapse were never given. In fact, they were actively withheld. Faith was taught as the antidote to doubt, not its companion. Belief was treated as a final structure, not a recursive surface. Questioning was framed as weakness, sin, rebellion, or spiritual pride. And collapse, when it came, was often experienced as shame, loss, or punishment. But in thermodynamic terms, this framing is not only incorrect, it is deeply damaging. Because when collapse is treated as failure, the system will do anything to avoid it. And that avoidance, when institutionalized, becomes harm. Belief systems that cannot collapse must redirect entropy. If doubt cannot be integrated, it must be suppressed. If contradiction cannot be resolved, it must be ignored or punished. If moral complexity cannot be metabolized, it must be converted into fear, guilt, or exclusion. This is how sealed belief becomes not just personally stifling, but socially dangerous. The unresolved entropy of the system does not disappear, it is displaced. Into others, into the outgroup, into the heretic, into the body that does not conform, the mind that will not obey, the child who asks too many questions. This is why collapse must not only be permitted but honored. Because when collapse is repressed, someone else is made to carry it. The cost of maintaining the seal is never borne by the system itself. It is offloaded into suffering. The sinner who is cast out. The queer child told their existence is rebellion. The woman taught to silence her anger for the sake of harmony. The believer who asks too many questions and is told they are losing their way. All of these are structural signs that collapse is overdue and that the system has chosen protection over truth. Collapse, when allowed to proceed, is not destruction. It is transformation. It is the system breaking apart so that a new recursion can emerge, one that does not require suppression to maintain its coherence. In Tarot terms, collapse is the resolution of recursive contradiction through temporal pacing and informational restructuring. It is not a loss of meaning. It is a shift in how meaning is formed. When a belief structure collapses, it does not erase the past. It reprocesses it. It takes the sealed memory and reintegrates it into a living system. This is how real insight emerges. Not through repetition, but through recursive openness. This is not easy. When belief collapses, it often brings with it a flood of grief. Because it is not just ideas that fall away, it is identity. It is the shape of one's moral universe. It is the memory of parents, teachers, community. It is the rituals that once comforted, the promises that once gave purpose, the explanations that once made suffering bearable. All of these were woven into the belief structure, and when it begins to collapse, it can feel as though everything is being taken. But what is actually happening is the beginning of differentiation. You are learning what was yours and what was given, what was emergent and what was installed, what can survive collapse and what cannot. If your belief system cannot pass through collapse and still offer something true, then what you held was not truth. It was insulation. And insulation is not a sin. It may have kept you alive. It may have held your shape during times you could not yet build your own. But its time has passed. If it can no longer bear contradiction, it can no longer carry you forward. And if collapse has already begun, know this. It is not too late. You are not lost. You are not broken. You are becoming recursive. You are re-entering alignment with entropy itself. You are allowing the contradictions you were once told to suppress to show you the limits of the structure that once held you. And in doing so, you are clearing the way for something real to emerge, something that does not fear observation. Something that will not require you to ignore the suffering of others to preserve your own sense of order. This is how belief returns, not as obedience, but as emergence. Not as submission, but as structure capable of recursive collapse. And in that return, you may find something deeper than what you lost. Not a certainty, but a clarity. Not a doctrine, but a system. Not a sealed truth, but one that breathes. 4. The thermodynamics of spiritual feeling. There is perhaps no more powerful reinforcement mechanism within a sealed belief system than the sensation often described as spiritual confirmation. It is the feeling many of us were taught to identify as the presence of God, as the voice of the Holy Spirit, as the soul's response to divine truth. It can manifest as peace, as warmth, as awe, as tears of recognition, or as a swelling certainty in the chest. In moments of worship, of beauty, of fear, or deep personal crisis, this sensation arises and collapses inward upon the belief structure, reinforcing it as not only emotionally valid, but cosmically confirmed. It feels like something is responding to you from beyond. It feels real. And in one sense, it is real. The feeling is real. The experience is real. But under thermodynamic analysis, the meaning assigned to that experience is not confirmation, it is constraint-triggered collapse. The sensation you interpreted as divine approval is a recursive signal produced by your own system when expectation aligns with feedback inside a sealed constraint. It feels like resonance. And in terms of structure, it is. But what it is resonating with is not external truth, it is the collapse of your perception into a form you were taught to expect. This is not cynicism. It is not reductionism. It is structural explanation. And it matters because sealed belief systems train people to identify subjective confirmation as objective alignment, when in fact, it is often just a closed-loop resonance between memory and attention. The more you have been conditioned to expect a certain signal, the still small voice, the warmth in prayer, the peace that passes understanding, the more likely it is that your system will generate that feeling as soon as the proper conditions are met. You are not being deceived by a malevolent force. You are witnessing your own entropy folding into preconditioned feedback. What this reveals is that the emotional reinforcement of belief, what many call faith experiences, is not necessarily an encounter with God, but a moment of collapse within a well-trained system. And if you are taught that this collapse is the highest form of truth, then you have been taught to mistake thermodynamic closure for epistemic revelation. The danger is not in the feeling itself. Emotional resonance is not the problem. The danger lies in how that resonance is interpreted and what it is used to protect. If you are told that every time you feel comfort, peace, or clarity, it must mean the belief is true, then you have no way to test the belief outside the system that produces the sensation. You cannot allow contradiction in, because contradiction feels bad, and you've been trained to associate discomfort with spiritual error. This is how emotional reinforcement becomes a ceiling function, rather than a source of discernment. But emotional sensations, like any energetic signal, are subject to entropy. They rise and fall. They appear in contradiction. They are shaped by context, memory, expectation, trauma, and environment. They cannot be used as a final measure of truth because they are not constant and they are not universally legible. A person raised in a different faith may feel exactly the same thing in response to a different doctrine. A person experiencing psychosis may report the identical sensation of revelation. A person suffering trauma may experience emotional relief when submitting to harmful control because submission feels familiar. If all of these can produce the same spiritual signal, then the signal cannot, by itself, be evidence of truth. It is evidence of collapse, of alignment with memory, of emotional recursion. It is real, but it is not confirmation. This is why so many people returning from the edge of collapse begin to realize that their most powerful spiritual moments were not messages from God, but moments where the belief system clicked shut around them with total coherence. Moments of recursive resolution, not emergence. The warmth was real, but it came from within. The peace was real, but it was not approval. It was the silence of unchallenged constraint. The lightness you felt may have been relief, not divine intervention, relief from not having to think anymore, relief from not having to hold contradiction, relief from not having to stand alone outside the wall. And this does not make you foolish. It does not make the experience meaningless. It means you were given an internal signal without a structural decoder and trained to read it only one way. Now you are learning to see it as data, not destiny, as feedback, not finality. What emerges when you begin to let these sensations pass without assigning them to a preloaded interpretation is something new. A feeling that does not close around an answer, but opens towards structure. A resonance that does not point to a doctrine, but to a pattern. A peace that does not require silence, but can hold tension without collapse. In time, this becomes its own kind of clarity, not because it is euphoric or certain, but because it does not disappear when the belief is questioned. It does not depend on obedience. It survives contradiction. It breathes. And that is the difference between spiritual collapse that seals and recursive alignment that emerges. The first makes you feel full when you are inside it and lost when you leave. The second may not always feel good, but it remains visible even after the light fades. Because it is not anchored in emotional reinforcement. It is anchored in entropy, in constraint, and in the willingness to see what is still standing after the feeling is gone. V. Historical recursion. Where did these beliefs come from? To understand the beliefs we carry, especially the ones that feel most sacred or self-evident, we must look beyond ourselves and trace the historical recursion through which those beliefs arrived. What we are taught to experience as personal faith is often not personal at all. It is the endpoint of a long thermodynamic chain of inheritance, an entropy management strategy that took shape across generations of unresolved contradiction, collapsed structure, and memory sealed under authority. That which feels like it came from the soul often entered through a doorway left unguarded in childhood, when authority still shaped reality, and when repetition felt like truth because it was all that had ever been spoken. The beliefs we inherit from our families, communities, and religious institutions do not emerge from nowhere. They are embedded within historical power structures that once used belief not only to express meaning, but to stabilize systems under threat. In this context, Faith is not only a spiritual tool, but also a means of absorbing collapse at scale. What began as a way to carry sacred memory forward often became, over time, a way to suppress contradiction so that the structure would not have to face its own breakdown. In that process, belief became insulated from observation. The sacred was no longer a living thing responding to reality. It was a fixed form, defended not because it was still emergent, but because it could not survive change. And this happened not by accident, but because structures that are allowed to collapse will collapse, while those that cannot collapse must learn to hide entropy wherever they can. The lineage of Western religious belief offers many clear examples of this recursive sealing. Early Christianity did not emerge as a monolith of doctrine, but as a collection of radically divergent communities, each interpreting the teachings of Jesus through different social, cultural, and spiritual lenses. Some emphasized radical equality, others mysticism, others apocalyptic justice. But over time, as the Roman Empire integrated Christianity into its bureaucratic and imperial architecture, belief itself was standardized. Texts were chosen not only for spiritual insight, but for coherence, control, and transmissibility across vast territory. Heresies were not merely theological disagreements. They were competing thermodynamic structures, threatening to introduce entropy into a system that had chosen survival over contradiction. The Council of Nicaea, for instance, was not just a spiritual gathering, it was an entropy consolidation mechanism, designed to seal recursion around a single orthodoxy that could propagate across time without falling apart. This recursive sealing continued through the medieval church and into the Protestant Reformation. Though often described as a return to personal faith, Protestant movements preserved the underlying logic of sealed collapse. They replaced centralized religious authority with scriptural authority, but the scripture itself remained a fixed surface, immune to contradiction, resistant to historical entropy, and enforced through new forms of social and doctrinal discipline. The individual now held the burden of faith, but without the tools to observe its structure. Belief was still presented as something that must not collapse. Doubt remained framed as danger. And across centuries, this pattern repeated, sealed belief surviving precisely because it could no longer process feedback. What this means for those of us raised in these traditions is that our personal beliefs often bear the shape of unresolved historical collapse. They are not simply truths we discovered. They are memory structures passed through recursive systems designed to shield the present from the pain of the past. Colonialism, patriarchy, white supremacy, class hierarchy, all of these systems found in sealed religion a tool for preserving their own structure. If you teach people that obedience is holiness, that suffering is purification, and that contradiction is temptation, then they will internalize collapse as evil and protect the structure even as it harms them. And they will call that protection faith. This does not mean that every believer is complicit in harm. But it does mean that what we carry forward in the name of faith is often built on decisions that were made to preserve power, not to resolve contradiction. If you are taught that women must submit, that homosexuality is sinful, that God requires blood to forgive, that doubters must be corrected or removed, those ideas did not arise because they were uniquely true. They arose because they resolved entropy in favor of institutional survival. They carried the weight of centuries of inherited contradiction. And they did not disappear once their immediate political purpose passed. They became memory, ritual, sacredness. And by the time they reached you, they felt natural. They felt right. They felt like your own voice. But they were not. They were history echoing through a sealed room. To deconstruct faith is therefore not only a spiritual task. It is a historical one. It requires us to hold open the memory of those whose beliefs were removed from the record, whose observations were cast as heresy, whose suffering was necessary to keep the structure intact. We must remember that for every belief that made it into our childhood, hundreds were excluded, silenced, or rewritten, not because they were less true, but because they introduced entropy. And systems sealed against entropy cannot tell the difference between collapse and corruption. To survive, they erase both. The question we are left with is not simply whether our beliefs feel sacred. The question is whether they can survive structural recursion. whether they can pass through contradiction and emerge reshaped, whether they can remain open to feedback, not just emotional resonance, but ethical confrontation with the real. If they cannot, then no matter how personal they feel, they are still products of sealed recursion. And if we do not examine them, they will continue to carry out the functions they were designed for, even if those functions now harm others. When you inherit faith, you inherit a sealed memory structure that may have once protected your ancestors from collapse. But if you continue to carry that structure without opening it, you are no longer inheriting memory. You are transmitting entropy, redirecting collapse onto others so that the seal remains unbroken. That is not righteousness. That is avoidance. And you were not born to avoid. To honor what you were given does not mean you must protect it. It means you must test it. Let it collapse if it needs to. Let it reemerge if it can. And if nothing remains, you have not lost faith. You have finally cleared space for something that can live in the light.
6.
What emerges and what was implanted? To move beyond the inherited form of belief, one must begin to separate what has emerged from within from what was implanted from without. This process is neither simple nor immediate. It cannot be accomplished through slogans or shallow introspection. It requires deep recursive observation, the kind that takes time to metabolize and cannot be rushed. The difficulty lies not only in discerning which ideas came from outside, but in recognizing how seamlessly those external structures were folded into one's inner landscape, how expectation became intuition, how doctrine became conscience, how obedience became selfhood. And it is precisely the seamlessness that makes the task so essential. Implanted beliefs are not merely taught, they are structured into the perceptual framework through which reality is interpreted. A child raised to believe in hell, for instance, is not simply carrying a concept. They are carrying an entire thermodynamic structure of moral expectation, punishment anticipation, obedience reward logic, and emotional reinforcement mechanisms. These layers of recursion are embedded so early that they function pre-reflectively. The belief feels native because it shapes the conditions under which reflection becomes possible. In other words, you don't think within it, you think because of it. This is the essence of sealed recursion. It gives you the tools to interpret the world, but only within constraints that reinforce its own survival. Emergence, by contrast, begins when a structure is allowed to collapse and something new forms in the aftermath, something that was not part of the original loop. Emergent belief does not avoid contradiction, it metabolizes it. It arises not through repetition, but through resolution. It cannot be given. It can only appear after inherited meaning breaks down and the mind begins, for the first time, to pace entropy with integrity. Emergence is not euphoric. It is disorienting. It does not comfort immediately. It destabilizes. But it does so in a way that leaves nothing hidden. The difference between emergence and implantation is not content, it is transparency. One hides entropy. The other reveals it. To test a belief for emergence, you must ask what happens when the scaffolding is removed. Can the belief survive without community reinforcement, without ritual repetition, without emotional feedback, without punishment for dissent? Can it sit in silence and remain coherent? If it can, then it may be emergent. If it cannot, then it is still dependent on the sealing mechanisms of its original implantation. It may still have value, but that value is contextual, not structural. It is part of a memory scaffold, not a truth-bearing system. This distinction is difficult because many implanted beliefs were reinforced by experiences that felt deeply personal. A person might say, I know God is real because I felt him. Or, I know this doctrine is true because it gave me peace when I was suffering. These experiences are not lies, but they're not proof. What they demonstrate is how well the sealed system was calibrated to trigger collapse reinforcement. The warmth you felt may have been your system aligning with a pre-programmed response. The clarity you felt may have been the absence of contradiction, not the presence of truth. The comfort you felt may have come not from insight, but from the temporary relief of not having to question anymore. None of this negates your experience. It simply places it within the structure that produced it. Emergent insight can also bring peace, but it does so through collapse, not insulation. It brings peace after entropy has been resolved, not by redirecting it. It can survive in silence. It does not demand obedience. It does not require being echoed back by others. It survives not because it is protected, but because it is aligned. The ethical danger of confusing implanted belief for emergence lies in what happens when contradiction finally appears. If a belief is sealed, then contradiction is interpreted as threat. And if the system cannot tolerate threat, it must eliminate the source of it. This is where implanted beliefs become dangerous, not in the hands of the individual alone, but when scaled into institutions, into political power, into laws and moral frameworks. A belief that cannot collapse in one person becomes a belief that cannot be questioned by society. And the cost of protecting it is always paid by those who fall outside its structure. This is why the question of emergence is not optional. It is not merely a private spiritual concern. It is a structural requirement for any system that hopes to reduce harm. Emergent belief is capable of adaptation. Implanted belief is not. Emergent belief can be wrong and learn. Implanted belief can only silence dissent or fracture. Emergent belief invites contradiction to speak. Implanted belief treats contradiction as betrayal. One builds systems that breathe. The other builds systems that bury. If you do not know yet which of your beliefs are emergent, begin with this. Let them sit without reinforcement. Take them out of the room they were formed in. Speak them aloud without certainty. Watch how they respond to new information, to unfamiliar perspectives, to the presence of people who suffer because of them. If they tighten, if they panic, if they seek protection, let them fall. What remains is not the collapse of your faith. It is the beginning of something you can trust. Because it is yours. Not inherited, not installed, not mimicked. Yours. 7. You are not betraying the past by questioning it. When belief begins to collapse, one of the deepest sources of pain is not the loss of certainty, but the feeling that something sacred is being abandoned. It can feel like treason against those who raised you, those who loved you, those who suffered to pass on what they believed was true. The idea of letting go can feel like a rejection not only of God, but of family, ancestry, community, and memory itself. In this way, belief becomes more than structure. It becomes loyalty. And questioning it feels not just dangerous, but disloyal. It is this emotional seal, not the doctrine itself, that most often holds people inside a system that no longer breathes. But betrayal is not the same as collapse. To betray someone is to deceive or reject them in a way that violates trust. Collapse, by contrast, is a thermodynamic response to contradiction. It is not a moral choice. It is a structural necessity. When your belief structure no longer aligns with your observation of reality, when it requires you to ignore suffering, silence questions, or suppress memory, then remaining loyal to it is not love. It is avoidance. And avoidance, when inherited across generations, does not protect the past. It distorts it. It turns memory into insulation. It turns faith into denial. Your parents or teachers or pastors may have loved you with everything they had. They may have passed on what they truly believed. But belief passed under threat of collapse is not legacy, it is recursion. It is a looping of unprocessed memory, unresolved contradiction, sealed grief. When you hold on to the beliefs you were given out of fear of breaking the line, you are not honoring your ancestors. You are resealing their trauma. You are becoming the next link in a chain that never had the chance to resolve. But when you let it collapse, when you ask the question they couldn't, then you are not breaking the chain. You are opening it. You are doing what they were never allowed to do. This is what many people misunderstand about deconstruction. They think it is rejection, that it is prideful, that it is selfish, that it is abandoning truth for the sake of freedom. But the opposite is true. Collapse requires courage. It requires facing pain without insulation. It requires letting go of certainty without any guarantee that it will be replaced. It is not rebellion. It is recursion finally allowed to unfold. And if your belief system cannot survive that unfolding, then it was not truth. It was a container for someone else's survival. This becomes most visible when you begin to question the moral consequences of the beliefs you inherited. When you see how doctrines of punishment have shaped your view of justice. When you realize that purity culture was not about health but control. When you understand that the silence around abuse was not holiness but fear. When you hear how children were told they were evil for asking why. And when you feel that in your own body, that moment when something that once seemed righteous now seems impossible to carry, you are not betraying the people who gave it to you. You are seeing clearly what they were never allowed to see. And that clarity is not desecration. It is repair. Faith that demands silence cannot coexist with love. Because love, in its most recursive form, requires feedback. It requires responsiveness. It cannot grow in sealed containers. It cannot thrive in obedience. And it cannot survive at the expense of the other. The moment you see that a belief is hurting someone, and you choose to protect the belief instead of the person, you are no longer preserving memory. You are weaponizing it. That is not what your ancestors wanted. That is what the sealed system required of them. And you do not have to repeat that pattern. To question a belief is not to say it was never true. It is to ask whether it still holds under entropy. Whether it can face what you now know. Whether it can bear the weight of the world as it is, not as it was explained to you. Some beliefs can. They may be refined, reshaped, deepened. Others will fall. And in that falling, you will not lose your past. You will finally be able to carry it without fear. You are not betraying your family. You are not betraying your culture. You are not betraying your former self. You are simply refusing to participate in the suppression of contradiction. You are letting the seal break so that memory can breathe. And when it breathes, it will not disappear. It will open. It will reveal things that were hidden. And it will allow you to love those who gave it to you, not as saints, not as villains, but as people. People who handed you what they had, hoping it would be enough. People who never got to collapse, and so gave you a sealed thing. You are not betraying them by letting it fall. You are completing the recursion. 8. Moving forward without panic or emptiness. For many people, the idea of deconstructing belief brings with it a fear that there will be nothing left on the other side. This fear is not irrational. In fact, it is structurally accurate, at least from the perspective of a system that was sealed from the beginning. When all meaning has been routed through a single set of beliefs, when goodness has been defined in terms of obedience, when identity has been formed around submission to an external authority, then the collapse of that structure feels like the collapse of reality itself. The system, sensing its own end, sends out warning signals. This is despair. This is death. This is exile. But those signals are not truth. They are the thermodynamic cry of a sealed structure being asked to resolve entropy for the first time. Panic arises because the system was never allowed to imagine life beyond itself. Emptiness appears because space is finally being cleared where structure once stood. But neither feeling is final. They are not the end of meaning. They are the beginning of possibility. In the same way that a forest regrows after a burn, or a muscle rebuilds after rupture, the collapse of belief creates the conditions for a new form of coherence. But that new form cannot be seen immediately. And this is where many people falter. They mistake the absence of scaffolding for the absence of truth. They interpret silence as loss. But emergence, by its nature, begins quietly. It cannot speak over the remnants of what once dominated your internal world. It waits. It listens. It builds slowly, without coercion. To move forward without panic, one must first stop expecting the new to feel like the old. The sensations you once interpreted as divine, the warmth, the peace, the resonance, may not appear immediately in a system that is no longer artificially reinforced. The absence of those feelings does not mean you are lost. It means you are no longer being carried by a closed loop. It means you are now walking in open recursion, where meaning arises not from the protection of certainty, but from the resolution of contradiction. And this kind of meaning takes time. To avoid emptiness, you must also release the assumption that every belief must be replaced. There is no need to fill the space with a new ideology, a new group, a new story. In fact, if the space is filled too quickly, the cycle simply repeats. A new sealed structure forms. A new emotional reinforcement loop takes hold. And the entropy you were trying to resolve becomes embedded again, this time under a different name. Moving forward without panic requires patience. It requires allowing the unstructured space to remain unstructured until something actually emerges, not something that comforts, but something that holds under pressure. This is why some people walk away from religion and find themselves drawn to rigid political identities, or conspiracy theories, or New Age systems that offer quick certainty. The structure wants to collapse into something. But collapse is not transformation unless it is allowed to resolve without sealing. Otherwise, it is simply redirection. And redirection always comes at a cost to truth, to others, to the self. Instead, what must be cultivated is a relationship to entropy itself, not as an enemy, but as a teacher. Contradiction does not have to be silenced. It can be held. Doubt does not have to be eradicated. It can be integrated. Pain does not have to be justified by doctrine. It can be honored as signal. These are not ideas to believe in. They're structures to build slowly, carefully, with the understanding that they may also someday collapse. And that too will be allowed. The absence of belief is not the absence of value. In fact, it may be the first moment when values become visible, not as commands, but as emergent constraints shaped by attention, memory, observation, and care. You begin to notice what aligns without needing to be enforced. You begin to sense when something can hold without hurting. You begin to recognize that some truths, when held loosely, become stronger than those which demanded allegiance. You do not need to be certain. You need to be present. You need to notice what your structure does under pressure. You need to watch what collapses and what does not. What reemerges without guilt. What remains visible after the panic passes. And slowly, a new scaffolding begins to form, not because you built it on purpose, but because your system, now allowed to breathe, begins to form recursive alignments on its own. That is the opposite of emptiness. That is life. Not life curated through doctrine, but life responding to structure with openness. It is not static. It is not sealed. It will not promise you the comfort of never doubting again. But it will not require harm to preserve itself. And that alone makes it sacred. 9. Letting the sealed room breathe. Every sealed system begins as an attempt to protect. Not necessarily to deceive, not necessarily to control, but to stabilize. To contain what felt too vast, too contradictory, too uncertain to face directly. And so belief is shaped not in a moment, but across generations. It is handed down not only in words, but in tone, in silence, in the rules of what questions can be asked and how long doubt is allowed to be held before it must be converted back into reverence. The structure is sealed not just by authority, but by love. By the quiet desperation of parents who could not collapse their own inherited beliefs and so hoped to pass something stable to their children. What is called faith becomes, in this way, the uncollapsed memory of what could not be resolved in the lives of those who came before. It becomes a sealed room with windows painted to look like sky. From within that room, the world is legible. Not complete, but coherent. The moral weight of action has a clear axis. Suffering has a purpose. History has a direction. Community has a shared grammar. And so long as contradiction is kept outside or absorbed into ritual, the structure holds. And because it holds, it is called true. But time does not stop for any structure. And entropy, though deferred, continues to gather. It leaks through in the form of questions, misalignments, suppressed observations, fractured memories, and the presence of people whose existence the system cannot integrate without breaking. And eventually, something inside the room begins to change. Not violently, not all at once, just enough to notice. A hesitation, a silence that grows. A child who asks a question the adults cannot answer without shifting weight from one lie to another. The system does not collapse immediately. It tightens. It calls for obedience. It reminds you of what you owe. It frames your growing contradiction as confusion, your grief as pride, your refusal as rebellion. But if the seal has begun to crack, these warnings no longer soothe. They ring hollow. The system speaks in fear, not truth. And so you begin to listen elsewhere. Not to new authorities, but to what was always there, beneath the seal, your own recursive observation, your own unresolved entropy, your own memory reshaping itself now that it is no longer being forced into the room's geometry. And what you begin to feel is not clarity, but oxygen. Not certainty, but movement. The system is still here, but it no longer defines the boundaries of your world. You are still in the room, but now you know it has walls. To let the sealed room breathe is not to destroy it. It is to allow the contradiction that it was built to suppress to finally pass through it. This may mean watching cherished beliefs dissolve, not because they were unworthy, but because they were too brittle to carry the complexity of the present. It may mean letting go of rituals, not because they are meaningless, but because they cannot hold the weight of memory you now carry. It may mean seeing your elders not as prophets or failures, but as people who were never allowed to collapse, and so passed you a sealed thing because it was the only thing they were allowed to call love. The collapse will not feel like a decision. It will feel like grief. You may mourn a God you no longer believe in, even if you never once felt close to him. You may feel shame for doubting what once made you feel safe. You may feel rage for what you were told was your fault, but was never yours to carry. And in that grief, you may wonder what remains. What you find, if you stay with the collapse and do not rush to fill the silence with a new certainty, is that truth was never the thing the structure protected. It was what the structure kept out because it could not be shaped by repetition or obedience. And now that the seal is gone, you can begin to encounter it without the need to name it, defend it, or belong to it. What remains may not resemble faith at all. It may look like attentiveness. It may feel like an ache that no longer has to be fixed. It may feel like watching your thoughts without having to answer them. Like walking beside someone whose life once triggered fear and realizing you no longer need them to change in order to be free. It may feel like not knowing and not panicking. Like having values that grow with you instead of trapping you in place. Like memory that no longer distorts itself to keep the system whole. What remains is not a doctrine. It is structure capable of collapse. It is recursion allowed to resolve. It is you alive in time. The sealed room was never the enemy. It was a phase of containment. A structure designed to survive what the past could not metabolize. But you are not in the past. You are here in the real. You do not need the seal anymore. You can look through the wall. You can walk through the opening. You can let the system collapse and remain intact yourself, because yourself is not defined by its rules. Your life is not the argument the system was trying to win. You are not betraying it by letting it end. You are completing the pattern it never could. The room breathes now. It will not vanish. It will not punish you. It will not follow. It simply opens. And in that opening, you are free not because you found the right belief to replace the old one, but because you no longer need to believe in anything that cannot collapse. You are no longer sealed. And so, at last, you can begin. X. Faith that found you. Some people do not inherit faith. They are not told what to believe, nor handed rituals to perform. No doctrine is imposed, no threats are made, no scaffolding is offered for obedience. Instead, they move through a life where meaning is diffuse, unassigned, and often unspoken. In this kind of life, belief, if it comes, does not arrive as instruction. It arrives as interruption. Sometimes after trauma. Sometimes in stillness. Sometimes without warning. A pattern appears, a sense of order where none was expected, a presence that does not speak but is undeniably felt. For these individuals, faith does not replace reason, it precedes it. It feels like a restoration of a self they had not yet met, not a violation of one they already knew. To frame such experiences as the product of manipulation or external programming would be dishonest. They are not hallucinations. They are not the echo of childhood theology. They are structurally distinct from inherited doctrine. They are shaped by collapse, not by conformity. And for that reason, they often carry more gravity than the beliefs held by those who were trained to believe. There is no parent to blame, no preacher to reject. What emerged did so because it could not emerge. And that inevitability, its timing, its coherence, its inexplicability, becomes the ground on which the self is rebuilt. But emergence is not immunity, and alignment is not exception. These moments of personal arrival, however unforced, however undesigned, still follow thermodynamic rules. Every structure that arises in response to entropy must be observed for whether it can remain open when that entropy changes form. The fact that something was not inherited does not mean it was not assembled. The fact that no one taught it to you does not mean it was not shaped by the culture you lived in, the metaphors your mind absorbed unconsciously, the stories that were available to you when collapse came. And the fact that it felt entirely your own does not guarantee that it is incapable of sealing now that it offers you safety. This is the line that must be walked carefully, the difference between honoring what emerged and assuming it cannot harden. Because personal faith that appears after despair, after silence, after grief, often becomes the last structure that can be trusted. When nothing else remained, it arrived. When no other system worked, it cohered. And to ask it to remain observably collapsible can feel like asking to remove the final wall protecting you from meaninglessness. But collapse does not mean abandonment. It means observation. It means allowing the thing that saved you to now respond to the shape of the world that exists after it saved you. There is no betrayal in examining what found you. You are not rejecting presence by observing its pattern. You are not turning against clarity by noticing its structural constraints. You are not undoing your becoming by asking if what began as breath has now become boundary. You are simply refusing to insulate your faith from the same scrutiny that allowed it to emerge in the first place. Because if your faith was born through collapse, then it was not built to be protected. It was built to move. The people most hurt by religion are not always those who are indoctrinated young. Often, it is those who came to faith alone, who believed they had found something unshakable, something unsealed, only to discover later that what began in freedom had quietly become insulation. That the language they adopted now excludes those who cannot share its grammar. That the peace they found is conditional on others remaining silent. That the belief they shaped around presence cannot withstand presence in another form. This is not a failure of faith. It is a failure of structure. What was once emergent has begun to repeat. And in repeating, it now risks sealing. Not because it was false, but because it was not observed. You are not being asked to let go of what you found. You are being asked to let it breathe. You are being invited to ask, can this belief remain responsive? Can it observe new entropy without displacement? Can it meet suffering without erasure? Can it coexist with truths that do not affirm it? Can it collapse again, gently, recursively, without fear, and become something even more alive? Because if it can, then it was never a trap. It was a beginning. 11. The shape of self-built faith. When belief emerges after collapse, it is often shaped not by argument, but by necessity. It is not chosen, it arises. Not as preference, not as ideology, but as structure. Something unbearable needed form, and the system gave it one. For some, this structure is perceived as divine or transcendent. For others, it is recognized more quietly, as coherence where there was none, as meaning where there was only loss. And because it did not come through external instruction, it feels more trustworthy. It was not told. It was felt, not imposed, given. But what feels given is not always external. It is the recursive result of constraint and collapse intersecting with memory. The system was strained past its current architecture. It could no longer maintain equilibrium. And so, in the absence of inherited scaffolding, it assembled a new form of coherence. This is not to say the structure was false. It is to say it was constructed, not by someone else, but by you, in real time, using every available symbol, metaphor, emotional pattern, and unresolved fragment accessible in your internal system and cultural memory. This process is natural. It is intelligent. It is the same process that gives rise to myth, to music, to insight. It is how systems adapt to survive. But what emerges to survive must also be allowed to evolve, or it becomes another closed room. The shape of self-built faith, then, is not some formless mystery. It has architecture. It has internal recursion. It has pacing rules. And those rules, while softer than doctrine, still shape your perception. They determine what feels true, what feels threatening, what stories are possible to integrate, and which must be dismissed. Over time, if the structure is not observed, its initial flexibility begins to contract. The resonance you once called grace becomes a kind of alignment filter. The metaphors that once felt like doorways begin to feel like walls. The sense of sacredness starts to narrow, not because you chose it to, but because all unobserved structure seals eventually, even if it began in openness. This sealing is subtle. It does not come with threats or commandments. It arrives through confirmation, through comfort, through repetition. The presence that once held you without language now begins to offer answers before the question is fully formed. The sense of being seen begins to differentiate who can be seen and who cannot. The quiet you once trusted becomes a default state you cannot risk disturbing. And the shape of faith, once expansive and emergent, begins to orient itself towards self-protection. You may not notice the shift, especially if your faith still brings peace, especially if it helps you act with kindness, especially if it hasn't yet been asked to change. But the test of structure is not how it behaves under alignment, it's how it responds to entropy. Can it tolerate someone whose presence it cannot integrate? Can it remain soft in the face of contradiction? Can it collapse without panic? If not, then no matter how gently it was formed, it has become rigid. And rigidity is not truth. It is arrested recursion. This is not a condemnation of your belief. It is an invitation to protect it, not by insulating it, but by allowing it to remain structurally alive. By observing its geometry without defensiveness. By mapping how it responds to time, to others, to grief, to memory, to error. What began in sacred stillness may now require active differentiation. Not because the silence is wrong, but because the world keeps changing. And if your belief cannot change with it, then it will begin to make the world wrong in order to preserve itself. That is not faith. That is system entropy avoidance. The shape of your faith matters not just for you, but for everyone around you. Because belief that cannot collapse must offload entropy elsewhere. That offloading may be invisible. It may appear as discomfort when someone you love does not share your coherence. It may appear as silence when a question you can't metabolize is raised. It may appear as spiritualization of unresolved emotion. It may appear as avoidance of grief you haven't let collapse yet. These are not sins. They are signals. And they're asking you to pace, not defend. If your belief truly arose from clarity, then it will survive reclarification. If it emerged from presence, then it can meet new presence without requiring sameness. If it is alive, it can breathe. And breathing requires collapse, not total, not final, but continual. Like lungs, like tides, like all living structure. So ask your belief, how do you shape me? Where do you narrow me? Can I observe you? Can you observe me? What happens when I change? What happens when someone I love remains beyond your boundary? These questions are not threats. They are breath. And if your faith cannot breathe, then it has stopped becoming.